All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's PARCC Testing Accommodations and Accessibility Features webinar for school year 2021. My name is Michael Craig, and I serve as the Assessment Specialist for Special Populations at OSSE. So the purpose of today's webinar is to provide an overview of accommodations and accessibility features available on the PARCC assessment. So during today's call, we will begin with a quick warm-up activity. We will discuss accommodations versus accessibility features. We will talk about utilizing accommodations in the classroom, remote testing accommodations, identifying accommodations for individual students, and dissecting specific accommodations that we tend to have questions about annually. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please utilize the chat feature. I will stop periodically throughout the presentation to answer specific questions that come in. So please do not hesitate to ask any questions that you may have. So the presentation is broken up into sections, and after each section, I will stop to answer questions. So before we begin our first section, this is an example of where we will be before I answer questions. So to kick things off, we're going to start with accommodations and accessibility features on the PARCC statewide assessment. All right, so our warm-up activity, I'm going to test your knowledge about accessibility features and accommodations. So on your screen, you see a list of accessibility features and accommodations. We have Notepad, large print edition, individual testing, eliminate answer choice, highlight tool, and human reader, human signer. So I'm going to give you a moment to mentally separate these into accommodations and accessibility features. You can either write them down or just separate them into groups in your mind, but I will give you a moment to do so. Again, Notepad, large print edition, individual testing, eliminate answer choice, highlight tool, human reader, human signer, which are accessibility features and which are accommodations. All right, so how did everyone do? Were you able to successfully separate them into two groups? All right, so on your left side, we have our accessibility features, which are eliminate answer choice, highlight tool, and Notepad. And on the right side, we have our accommodations, which are human reader, human signer, large print edition, and individual testing. So I hope you were all able to identify and differentiate between your accessibility feature and your accommodations. All right, so according to the PARCC Accessibility Features and Accommodations Manual, the 6th edition, accessibility features are tools or preferences that are either built into the assessment system or provided externally by the test administrator. Accessibility features can be used by any student taking the PARCC assessment. Accommodations are considered to be adjustments to the testing conditions, test format, or test administration that provide equitable access during assessments for students with disabilities and students who are English learners. But the key distinction between those two is that students with disabilities are legally entitled to their accommodations. So for school year 2021, we have the following assessments that will be administered in the District of Columbia. We have our PARCC ELA literacy assessment for students in grades 3 through high school, and they are aligned to Common Core state standards. We have our PARCC math assessment for students in grades 3 through 8, Algebra 1, and Algebra 2. Some students who took advanced math in middle school may be required to take Algebra 2 in high school. The integrated pathway is still available. We have our multi-state alternate assessment, also known as MSAA, for students in grades 3 through 8 and 11 with significant cognitive disabilities. They are aligned to our alternate achievement standards. We have our WIDA Access for L's 2.0 assessment for students in grades K through 12 for our English learners. And we have our alternate access for students in grades 1 through 12 for our English learners. So it looks like I'm getting some notifications that the audio is fading in and out. Give me 1 second. All right, please let me know if it's still fading. If you can hear me or if it sounds better, just type in the chat feature to let me know. All right, so our testing format and testing windows for school year 2021, we have our Access for L's administration, which will take place February 15th through April 9th. Excuse me, that will take place in person for students reporting to school and reporting to school for instruction. We have our MSAA, which will take place March 15th through April 30th. Also for in-person instruction for students reporting for in-person instruction. And we have our PARCC assessment, which we will focus on today, which will take place April 5th through May 28th for our online testing, and for our paper testing with accommodations only, April 5th through May 21st. There is a remote testing or in-person option for our PARCC administration. So each year, OSCE releases the statewide assessments, participation, and policy documents. We are pleased to announce that the statewide assessment participation policy document for school year 2021 has been posted to the OSCE assessment website. Within this document, you will find critical information regarding this year's required assessment participation universe and special considerations that can be and special considerations for administration. LEA should make sure they reference these documents for clarification on what it means to be in person and remote for the purposes of statewide testing. So again, just to reiterate that the statewide assessment participation policy document has been released for this year. It is posted on the OSCE statewide assessment website. There's information that all LEAs should reference in this document around what it needs to be in person and remote for the purposes of statewide testing. All right, so I'm reading the chat, and it seems that a lot of people are having issues with the audio. Give me one moment. I'm going to call in. So I'm using the computer audio, so I'm going to call in from the phone. One second.
All right, so each year the PARCC Consortium updates the PARCC Accessibility Features and Accommodations Manual. This manual is a resource that LEA should use. It features all the accommodations and accessibility features that are available on the PARCC assessment. There's qualifying criteria for each feature within the document, and there's in-depth guidance for administering each accessibility feature as well as accommodation. This resource can be found at dc.mypearsonsupport.com/manuals. It is a very important resource for our LEAs to use when planning to administer accommodations. As a supplement to that, OSCE releases each year the Testing Accommodations Guide. These are our accessibility features and accommodations manual. These can be used these will be your go-to resource for identifying accommodations and accessibility features within the District of Columbia. So there are 3 guides that our LEA should reference. We have our Testing Accessibility Features and Administrative Considerations Guide. We have our Testing Accommodations Guide Part 1 for students with disabilities, and we have our Testing Accommodations Guide Part 2 for English learners. These have been updated with considerations for remote administration, for accessibility and accommodation and fairness, which we will discuss later in the presentation. So these guides have been completed and will be posted to the OSCE website this week, as well as released to our LEAs via the NGA bulletin. So you can look for these accommodations guides later this week. So when identifying accessibility features and accommodations within the testing platform and the PARCC Consortium, we have to first look at the entire accessibility system. So there are three areas that that make up the accessibility system. First, we have our accessibility features, which are available to all students, and they can access at any time, and these are features that are built into the platform. We have our accessibility features that are pre-selected for specific students. So these must be specifically selected for students' registration. They must be identified in the PMP. And then finally, we have our accommodations for students with disabilities and English learners. These accommodations must be documented in the student's IEP, EL, or 504 plan, and should also be indicated in the student's personal needs profile. And here are a few examples of each accessibility feature or accommodation. So accessibility features that are available to all students that are testing, we have our pop-up glossary, external spell check, repetition of directions, those that need to be identified prior to the assessment. We have our text-to-speech, color contrast, and some accommodations that we have for students. We have text-to-speech for ELA, calculation device, and for our English learners, we have word-to-word dictionary and translation of math to Spanish. So when identifying accommodations, there are four distinct groups of students that may receive accommodation on statewide assessments. First, of course, we have our students with IEPs. We have our students with 504 plans. We have our English learners, and then we also have our English learners with disabilities who have an IEP or 504 plan eligible for both sets of accommodations. So here's an image. It's actually one of my favorite images of accessibility and fairness. It gives a perfect example of what we want to see for our students that are receiving accommodation and accessibility features. So on our left, we have an adult with two children. They're all standing on the same size box, trying to watch a baseball game, but we see the smallest student is unable to view the game. That's equality because they're all standing on the same size box. But on our right, we see that the adult has now given the smallest child his box, so they're all able to see the baseball game. So that's equity. So basically, that's our goal when using accommodation and accessibility features, or more specifically accommodations. We want to level the playing field for our students and giving them access as their non-disabled peers. All right, so I'm going to take a moment to stop, check the chat box for any questions that we have before we proceed to the next section. All right, great. So it seems that the audio is working clearly for everyone. Thank you for bearing with me. We know we're all working remotely, so I'm glad we are able to get that solved and everyone can hear me now. So question, can we offer accessibility features to all students? Yes, so accessibility features are available to all students. You can reference the accommodations guide that I discussed earlier, or the PARCC accessibility features manual to identify those accessibility features that are available to all students. All right, so our next section, classroom versus statewide assessment accommodations. So, accommodations should never reduce the learning expectations by reducing the scope, complexity, or rigor of classroom assessment. Accommodations should be consistent with those provided for classroom instruction and classroom assessments, provide equitable access during instruction and assessment, mitigate the effects of a student's disability, not reduce performance expectations, and not change the construct being assessed. So when students are using accommodations in the classroom, we should make sure that they are consistent with those that are being provided during those classroom assessments. The accommodations used in the classroom should support the students' ability and should reduce those performance expectations. We want to make sure that students are actually utilizing their accommodations and they are providing them with that access that they need to perform in the classroom on assignments as well as during classroom instruction and assessments. When determining accommodations, the IEP team, 504 or EO team should discuss which accessibility features and accommodations might assist a student during daily instruction, determine which accessibility features and accommodations to try out with the student during instruction, document and evaluate the effectiveness of the accessibility features and accommodations, adjust the student's use during instruction, and determine which accessibility features and accommodations to use on PARCC based on classroom results. So it's important for students to try out these specific accommodations that they're using during classroom instruction. We want to make sure that these accommodations are just actually being utilized and they are helping the students perform. It's also important to remember that the IEP team should come back to the table and conduct a 30-day review after documenting the effectiveness of the accommodation to say, hey, if the student is not actually utilizing them, we can try out other accommodations to help them. We also need to make sure that we're getting student input when identifying what accommodation should be used. Statewide accessibility features and accommodations should not be assigned broadly to all students with the same disability. We need to make sure that accommodations are being individualized and being used for the specific needs to meet the needs of each student. The IEP team, 504 EO team should discuss accessibility features and accommodations separately for each PARCC content assessment area. Select accessibility features and accommodations that increase a student's access to assessment and remove barriers. Obtain student input when selecting accessibility features and accommodations. And avoid using the kitchen sink method that provides students with unnecessary or mutually contradictory accommodations. So that's a key point to remember, that a lot of times we've all been in IEP meetings or we've seen a student's IEP and they may have a laundry list of accommodations that are listed and the student's actually not even using them. So in this case, we need to make sure that we are using and selecting the appropriate accommodations. Don't just use, again, the kitchen sink method. We want to make sure that the accommodations are specific and we receive student input, and they're actually going to be utilized on the PARCC assessment and what will help the student best perform on the statewide assessment. All right, I'm going to take a moment to stop and check the chat box for any questions. All right, so it looks like we have a question around the accommodations manual. When can we expect them? They will be submitted to the OSCE communication team today, and it will take them maybe a day or two to turn around to post it to the OSCE website. So before the end of the week, you should be able to see them on the OSCE website. All right, so our next section is a new section. We have remote testing accommodations. So this will be new guidance around accommodations that are available during remote testing. So accommodations provided to students on the PARCC assessment must be generally consistent with those provided for distance learning and formative assessments. So throughout today's presentation, you will hear that theme about consistency with accommodations. So we want to make sure that accommodations are consistent in the classroom, as well as distance learning and on formative assessment. Schools and LEAs are responsible for ensuring that all students receive the appropriate accommodations during remote testing, keeping in mind that the method of delivery may look different than if the student were in person. So we know that we are all working remotely, and schools are providing instruction in a distance learning method. So those accommodations may look different this year. While some accessibility features and accommodations need to be administered externally by a test administrator, most are embedded into the TestNav online platform. So you will see that most of these accessibility features and accommodations are available within TestNav, but there are a few that we will discuss that are not and are human administered. Students who receive accommodations delivered by a test administrator, such as the human reader, human scribe, or signer, may test via remote administration. And we will discuss guidance on what that looks like momentarily. So due to COVID-19, testing administration will look different. Therefore, the delivery of assessment may look different. So all accommodated testing requiring paper test materials must be administered in person only, as secure paper materials cannot leave school buildings. All paper-based accommodations, such as Braille, large print, or paper-based tests, must be administered in person. Schools that are open and serving students in any capacity, or in-person or hybrid instruction, or are operating distance learning hubs, are required to provide the opportunity for students using paper-based accommodations to test in person. Families that have chosen to participate exclusively in distance learning are not required to send their students to school to test. So again, this is new information and new guidance around paper-based accommodations during testing. It's important to remember that schools and LEAs are to develop protocols for the delivery of accommodations that are not embedded into the TestNav platform. And most importantly, we want to make sure that schools that are open for in-person, hybrid, or operating any type of learning hubs are giving students the opportunity that use paper-based accommodations to test in person, unless the parents have chosen exclusively for distance learning. They are not required to send their students to school to test. So this year, again, we have new guidance around testing accommodations. So within the guides that we mentioned earlier, testing accommodations guide for students with disabilities and English learners, there will be new guidance around remote administration of human administered accommodations. So we have our three guides I mentioned earlier. We have accessibility features guide, that's part 0, part 1, and part 2. Part 1 is for our students with disabilities, and part 2 is for English learners. Within that document, you will have Appendix C, which is in part 1. You will see a crosswalk that contains examples of how to administer accommodations remotely. And we will also walk through the Appendix C momentarily, but it's going to give you examples of how to administer accommodations. We know that schools have been operating and providing accommodations to students throughout the year. So if LEAs have alternative means of administering specific accommodations, reach out to OSCE directly, reach out to me and let me know if you have different ideas about how to administer specific accommodations that we will discuss momentarily. So again, that's for Part 1 for students with disabilities. Part 2, English learners, you have Appendix A, and it's going to be the same thing as a crosswalk with those accommodations that are available in SEDS, PARCC, and then it gives you specific examples of what those accommodations will look like. All right, so our human administered accommodations. Here are a list of accommodations in SEDS and what they align to in PARCC and in the PARCC manual. So we have our clarification of repetition directions, redirect students, directions in ASL. We have our read aloud, our scribe, speech to text, signer, and this is for ELA, constructive response, ELA selective response, and non-ELA. So you can see that these accommodations are what's listed in SEDS and how they align to what is in PARCC. These are all our human administered accommodations, and this guidance will also be located in the testing accommodations manual for students with disabilities. So similarly, we have a list of accommodations, human administered accommodations for our English learners. So on your left, you have your SEDS accommodations, so general administration directions clarified in native language, directions read aloud and repeated, redirect students, scribe or speech to text, and human reader and text to speech, and you see how it aligns to our PARCC accommodations. So as mentioned earlier, we have there are new appendices were added to the guide. So here's a snapshot of what Appendix C looks like in the Students with Disabilities Guide. So on your left, like we presented earlier, we have our accommodations that are listed in SEDS. We have the PARCC description, and then we have our definition or examples of what this accommodation will look like. So let's take the first one, read aloud for ELA literacy assessment. That's what is listed in SEDS. That's how it's listed in SEDS. In the PARCC manual is ELA literacy assessment, human reader, human signer. So an example of this or how this can be administered this year, we have the test administrator logs into TestNav using the provided TA login credentials. The TA reads or signs the test via external meeting application. So any external meeting application that your LEA is currently using, the TA will log into that and read or sign the assessment to the student that way. Or student uses text-to-speech function to hear the test questions and passages read aloud. The IEP team must follow the Lea protocols for amending the IEP if the accommodation is not currently listed on the student's IEP. So these are some options for LEAs to follow this school year. If the accommodation is not currently listed on the IEP, the IEP team will have to follow the LEA specific protocols around amending IEPs. So there's guidance within both appendices that talks about what is available and how human administered accommodations can be administered this year, specifically in a remote posture. It's also important to remember that the way in which students receive accommodations may look different if they were in person, but every reasonable effort should be made to ensure that students receive the support to which they have and which they are entitled to. All right, before we move on to the next section, I'm going to stop and take a moment to answer any questions that have come into the chat. All right, great. So I see a couple of questions, and I will try to get to all of them. If I don't, feel free to send me an email with your question, and I will try to answer it, and I will provide you with a response. But one of the questions, how do we ensure that accommodations on your IEP make it into the system? I believe you're referring to the SRPNP. So this is what you will complete, your LEA will complete the student's personal needs profile within Pearson Access Next. That's within PAN. So I believe that's what you're referring to, unless you're referring to SET. So just make sure, if you have additional questions about that, just send me an email. But you will put the accommodations in PAN. Will we receive a copy of this PowerPoint? Yes, we can post it to the OSCE website, and we will also send it out via the NGA bulletin. Clarification around third-party external app uses. So whatever external learning platform that your school, your LEA is currently utilizing, your test administrator will log into that with the student in a one-on-one session and utilize and read the test administrator script to the student. I noticed that the ELA Read Aloud says they can log in to administer, but the math requires going into the school. Yeah, so the math script is a paper-based script based on how the math formulas are read. So it requires a test administrator to actually go into the physical building because it is a paper-based script, and paper-based materials cannot leave school buildings because they are secure materials. and there's not an online version of the math script for the PARCC assessment. So that's why it requires the test administrator to go into the building. All right, so again, if I did not get to your question, I would definitely feel free to email me any questions that you may have regarding the presentation. All right, so our next selection, we're discussing selecting accessibility features and accommodations for students. So the IEP team responsible for selecting accessibility features and accommodations for students with English or disabilities and English learners should identify which features might support a student during daily instruction, try out the accessibility feature or accommodation with the student during instruction in the content area, evaluate the effectiveness of the feature or accommodation, and determine which should be used on the PARCC assessment. The decision-making process should also be utilized when identifying accommodations and accessibility features to use for students. IEP teams should take into consideration this process when selecting accommodation for students with disabilities, and this process can also be replicated when assigning accessibility features. So some of the factors that come into play are student characteristics, individual test characteristics, as well as PARCC accommodation policy. So when you're looking at student characteristics, you want to find out what are the needs of the students, what accommodations does the student regularly use in the classroom, and has the student indicated preferences in using the accommodation. And that's also a key distinction, because a lot of times we fail to receive input or to get input from students about what accommodations they find best or what actually helps them in the classroom. Too often, IEP teams just try to provide all of the accommodations to students, but that's not really helping the students progress. So we need to make sure that we're getting student input when identifying what accommodations should be used. Student characteristics and access needs impact the selection of accessibility features and accommodations. Accessibility features and accommodations should remove barriers to learning. So we have our student characteristics, we have their needs, so their access needs, the accommodations, and valid measures of what the student knows and can do. So a good example for this would be a student that is visually impaired. So we have the student characteristics. They may have a visual impairment. What they need, they could require either Braille or large print, assigning the accommodation, and then in valid measure of what the student knows can or cannot do. So will the student benefit from having a Braille assessment or having large print assessment based on their disability? So when we have our individual testing characteristics, we're going to look at examining the test of the skills that the tasks that the students are being asked to do on the PARCC assessment, characteristics of those assessments, assessment tasks and classroom assessment tasks, their similarities, so comparing what the student is doing on the PARCC assessment as well as what they're doing in the classroom, accessibility and accommodations, similarity in the classroom as well as statewide assessment, and then existing barrier removal by using accessibility features and accommodations. So it's important to know about what is being asked on the PARCC assessment. LEA schools, IEP teams can view release items as well as helping students take practice tests to see what is being asked on the PARCC assessment. These practice test release items can be found On that same website we discussed earlier on dc.mypearsonsupport.com, this is a great way for students to access the practice and actually become familiar with the tasks that are being asked of them. And then we can also see PARCC results and resources that can be found on the OSCE website and the PARCC results and resources page. This will allow you to see release items that can be used during instruction and just give students the opportunity to practice those tests and those tasks being asked of them before they actually take the PARCC assessment. So some guiding questions for accessibility feature and accommodation selection. So IEP teams, when meeting, can ask these guiding questions before identifying what accommodation or accessibility features can be used on the statewide assessment. So what are the students' learning strengths and challenges, and are these based on language needs, disability, or both? Which accessibility features and or accommodations are regularly used by students during instruction and assessment? What difficulties did the student experience when using accessibility features and or accommodations? Should an existing accessibility feature or accommodation be implemented differently? And what specialized instruction is required by the student to achieve grade level or course content Common Core standards? So again, we want to make sure that we're utilizing and providing our students with the best accommodation or accessibility features that is going to help them to be academically successful on the PARCC assessment as well as in the classroom and classroom-based assessment. So it's all about trying and figuring out what students' needs and how it's going to best meet their needs. All right, so we're going to take a moment to check the chat box and answer any questions. All right, so thank you for your questions. There are a couple of questions around virtual sessions. So do all virtual sessions need to be administered one-on-one or only read aloud sessions? So that's only your read aloud session. If you have the student has a read aloud accommodation, that would need to be administered one-to-one, and that's when you will utilize your virtual learning platform. Can you repeat and clarify math assessment again regarding TAs coming into the building? So that was regarding students with the read aloud for math. If that's going to require, if the student is going to use a read aloud with math, the TA has to be in the building because the script is a paper-based script, and therefore the paper-based script cannot leave the school building because it is a secure item. The IEP team can also amend the IEP to use the text to speech, but if the student is going to use the read aloud, the TA must come into the school building because it is a secure material, and that's based on the way the script is written and how you read math formulas. So there's not an online version of that script, thus it cannot leave the school building. All right, so our last section, we'll be discussing dissecting specific accommodations. So each year we have questions around a few specific accommodations. So we like to give additional guidance around what that looks like. Read aloud for ELA literacy assessment. This tends to be a lot of questions around what this actually looks like and who can utilize this who can use this accommodation. So again, this is read aloud guidance for specific accommodations. We have text-to-speech, ASL video, human reader, human signer. This is what it says in the PARCC manual, but instead it'll say read aloud for ELA literacy assessments. So student uses the human reader, human signer, text-to-speech function to hear the test question and passages read aloud for the ELA literacy assessment. This is often intended for a small number of students with printed-related disabilities who would otherwise be unable to participate in the assessment. The student disability severely limits or prevents their ability to access printed text by decoding. This is not intended for students reading somewhat or moderately below grade level. And again, it's observable repeated attempts to teach the student how to decode printed text without success. So this specific accommodation is intended for a small group of students that are unable to decode printed text. The IEP team would have to determine if this is the correct accommodation for students, but we just want to highlight that this is intended for a small group of students. Calculation device on non-calculated section. This is what it says, and in the PARCC manual, it says calculation device and mathematics tool. So it provides access for students with a disability that severely limits or prevents their ability to perform basic calculations. This student is unable to perform single-digit addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division. Students' inability to perform math calculation is documented in evaluation summaries from locally administered diagnostic assessments. And the student receives ongoing intensive instruction and/or interventions to learn to calculate without using a calculation device. So again, intended for a small subset of students that are unable to perform single-digit addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. So it should not be overutilized. The IEP team will also have to determine if this accommodation best meets the needs of the student, but again, it is intended for a small subset of students. Text-to-speech for math. We have our human reader, human signer accessibility feature for mathematics. Student uses the human reader, human signer text-to-speech function or audio file function to hear the test. Students should be grouped together with those taking the same test form. Human reader for mathematics is also an accessibility feature, and you can refer to Appendix B in the PARCC manual that we discussed earlier for additional guidance around this feature. And lastly, we have our unique accommodations. We know that some of our students may require, a unique or non-standard accommodation that is not listed on their IEP, and it does not change the construct of what is being measured on the test, but they require it to perform on a statewide assessment or a classroom assessment. The request form should be completed and submitted to the assessment team at least 4 weeks prior to school testing. The 2021 Unique Accommodation Form can be found on the OSCE website. It's also linked to this presentation. Unique accommodations are intended to support the student's ability to perform on a statewide assessment, and requests to potentially invalidate a student's score will not be approved by OSCE. So again, we read the request that you submit, and we want to make sure that the student will actually utilize the unique accommodation, and it is an accommodation that will not invalidate the student's test scores. So if you have that, have that case and you have students that require specific accommodations or unique accommodations, feel free to complete a form and you will submit it to OSSE via the OSSE support tool. Please do not email the forms because they have student PII, but again, make sure you complete the form and submit it through the OSSE support tool. All right, so I am going to pause for a moment and view the chat box. All right, so there are questions around medical exemptions. If there are medical exemptions, you would follow the same protocol, complete the medical exemption, and submit them via the OSSE support tool. We're reading questions about, there are questions about the text-to-speech. Correct. So if a student has text-to-speech, the TA does not have to come into the building. That is correct. If the student uses the read aloud accommodation, and the test administrator can use the TA script, they do not have to come into the building for ELA. That is correct. There's a question around the size of small groups and can they be mixed text-to-speech with non-text-to-speech and just all virtual. That is a good question. I would look into additional guidance around that information. Feel free to email me that question as well. All right, so it looks like that is all of our questions. If I did not get to your question, feel free to email me directly. I can be reached at michael.craig@dc.gov, or you can call me 202-257-3371. Again, we will post this presentation to the OPSI website. We'll also send it out via the NGA bulletin. But again, any questions, feel free to contact me directly if you did not have your questions answered today. So again, thank you for participating in today's PARCC Accessibility Features and Accommodations webinar for school year 2021. I will stay on to answer any additional questions that you may have. So Stephanie, for students that have Scribe, Stephanie Storley, for students that have Scribe for selected response, the TA will log into the external platform so they can scribe the students' responses. I believe that's your question. Okay, I understand your question now. Let me look into that because I see what you're saying. They have to go back, the student and TA have to go back and forth with login in this situation. I will look into that and get your response. Feel free to also email me this question